Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're looking at a pretty fascinating intersection between nature and hard numbers. We're going to explore exactly how forestry companies mathematically track biodiversity and conservation efforts using the SASB forestry management standards. It's not just about counting trees anymore, it's about rigorously accounting for the ecosystems those trees actually support. So here's our roadmap for today. We're taking a bit of a Venn diagram approach. We'll start broad with ecosystems beyond the timber, then define protected conservation status, look at the active management rule, track endangered species habitats, and finally, bring it all together by measuring the spatial overlap.
Section 1. Ecosystems beyond the timber. When we think about forestry management, it's incredibly easy to just default to timber yield, right? Like how much wood is actually being harvested. But to truly understand a company's environmental footprint, we have to shift that perspective. Take a look at this foundational context straight from the SASB standards. It says, along with their timber outfit, forests provide valuable ecosystem services, including carbon sequestration, wildlife habitat, water purification, and storage. Forestry just doesn't happen in a vacuum. Because regulations and consumer demands are increasingly tied to environmental preservation, companies literally have to track these geographic areas precisely to prove their corporate sustainability. And this table perfectly illustrates exactly how they do that. When you look at the disclosure topics for ecosystem services, check out metrics RR-FM-160a.2 and 160a.3. These require companies to report the area of forest land with protected conservation status and the area of forest land in endangered species habitat. And notice the unit of measure for both of these? Hectares. We aren't dealing with vague corporate promises here. We are talking about strict geographical accounting that investors can actually rely on.
Section 2. Defining protected conservation status. Which brings us to the first circle of our conceptual Venn diagram. What actually counts as having protected conservation status? Well, the SASB framework is incredibly strict on this. It's explicitly defined as areas legally designated as protected by government regulation or listed in recognized conservation databases, measured strictly in hectares. A company cannot simply draw a circle on a map, call it a nature reserve, and claim the ESG credit for it. It requires formal, external designation, period. To be completely specific about it, the standard lists exactly what qualifies. We're talking about national parks, national wildlife refuges, Natura 2000 sites, and areas mapped on the World Database of Protected Areas. By locking the metric down to these legal designations, the standard guarantees that the data analysts see is completely standardized and legally verifiable. Absolutely no corporate guesswork allowed. Section 3. The Active Management Rule. Now, what's really interesting about this is how the standard filters out what we might call passive landholding. The scope of this metric only includes areas actively managed by or for the entity. It's a stark contrast. If land is exclusively set aside for conservation and just left alone, passive conservation, it's explicitly excluded. A forestry company can't just buy a plot of protected land, completely ignore it, and then slap it on their sustainability report. They have to actually put the work in and actively manage that conservation area to get the accounting credit. Section 4. Tracking endangered species habitats. So let's pivot over to the second circle of our Venn diagram. This metric tracks the area of forest land located in endangered species habitats. And just like with the protected lands, there is absolutely no room for internal corporate definitions. These are forest lands officially designated by applicable jurisdictional laws where endangered or threatened species actually inhabit. It relies entirely on strict external jurisdictional threat classifications. If the local law says an endangered species lives there, those hectares get tracked. The standard even clarifies the distinct legal thresholds between these specific classifications. An endangered species is one that is currently in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. A threatened species, on the other hand, is one that is likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future. If managed forest lands happen to overlap with critical habitats for either of those classifications, every single one of those hectares must be tallied and reported.
Section 5. Measuring the spatial overlap.
Let's move to and see how this builds into the climax of our geographical accounting today. We've looked at protected lands and we've looked at endangered habitats. But here is the absolutely critical question. What happens when they share the exact same map? Because in the real world, these two things intersect all the time. A national park, for instance, might also be the critical habitat for a threatened species.
Well, SASB rules explicitly mandate that entities disclose any spatial overlap between these two metrics. If you visualize a hypothetical breakdown, you'd have your total protected status area, your endangered habitat area, and then a very specific carve-out noting the spatial overlap between the two. Why? Because it forces total transparency and prevents double counting. A company can't count a single hectare twice just to artificially inflate their ESG scorecard, while at the same time they are forced to map out exactly where their critical conservation work is centralized.
Which brings us to our final thought for today. How does mathematically tracking every single hectare of habitat transform our standard for true corporate sustainability? Well, by stripping away the marketing fluff and replacing it with strict geographical accounting, requiring legal designations, proving active management, and explicitly accounting for spatial overlaps, we move entirely away from vague greenwashing. We finally arrive at hard, quantifiable ESG data that tells us exactly how the ecosystems beyond the timber are actually being treated. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this leaves you looking at corporate forestry reports in a completely new light. See you next time.